And now we have the Native Americans and Europeans part 2. So we have to look at religion when it comes to the relationship between these European powers and the Native Americans. The thing is, we have to look at how much they wanted to convert the Native Americans and how they would go about doing this. For instance, for the Spanish, we get a lot of like Franciscan priests. The Franciscans were a sector of Catholicism. They would do things like wear fine clothes that might impress the Native Americans, give them gifts, make therefore the Native Americans feel indebted to actually like listen to their Christian message and everything. They might help them build houses and churches, once again, trying to make them feel indebted. A big part of conversion came from the fact that right after Native Americans might be baptized, a lot of times epidemics would devastate local Native villages, but oftentimes they would spare the Spaniards, making the Native Americans think that, oh, the Spanish gods must be more powerful than their own. And so this would in fact cause more conversions, which could cause then more epidemics eventually. The thing is, the Spanish, when they converted Native Americans, really wanted the natives to abandon all of their previous ways of life, but this is extremely hard to do so. Conversion is a very complicated process. The thing is, a lot of times if someone decides to convert even today to a different religion, they might culturally still be their original religion. An example of this is someone who might have converted from Catholicism to being Protestant might still walk into a Protestant church and automatically do the sign of the cross just because that might have been a part of their childhood all along. And so the thing is, the Spanish didn't want the Native Americans to even culturally be part of their original religion. And this was extremely hard for the Native Americans to necessarily give up. And so a lot of times Native Americans might still practice their own religions in secret, though, because if missionaries found them, they might react badly and include some sort of severe punishment that could actually lead to their death. For the French, we see actually a lot of similarities to the Spanish in that they'd have a lot of the same ideas, like causing awe amongst the Native Americans, using, European technology and the Catholic rich vestments and rituals and everything. The French also a lot of times would use economic reasoning. They might only trade with converted Indians or give, discounts to Native Americans who converted to being a good Catholic and everything. Once again, you see things like epidemics sparking conversion amongst the French missionaries as well, or causing conversion amongst Native Americans when they were in contact with the French. The French, though, generally were resigned to a more gradual approach to conversion. They would take small changes and hope for like the whole transformation over time, basically. And then we have the English, and they're a bit different. The thing is, they're much less successful at attracting Native Americans to convert. The thing is, Protestant practices held very little allure for the Indians, generally speaking. They didn't have the rich vestments. Remember, the Puritans wanted to get away from all of that. You do have some Anglican missionaries in the southern colonies, but they don't really even start a lot of their work until like the 18th century, so that'd be like the 1700s. It's more, when we look at the English trying to convert Native Americans, it's more like on an individual basis rather than like on a whole, so to speak. We're also going to have 3 really big conflicts that I want to go into detail here about. These 3 conflicts are first going to be New England, King Philip's War, then we're going to have in Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion, and then the third will be in New Mexico and will be the Pueblo Revolt. So the first 2 of these are looking at the English. So notice we don't even go into the French here. So King Philip's War that you can see here occurs in New England. So what happens is in 1675, Metacom, who was known as King Philip by the English. So Metacom was the leader of the Wampanoags, and he wanted to preserve their independence against incursions of colonists. What happened was, in the lead up to this, the colonial court in New England sentenced like 3 Native Americans to hang for like murdering a Christian Indian who had actually warned the English of an Indian's attack. Then the colonists in this area had gone on to like kill an Indian that they found looting in an abandoned house. And so the thing is, like, these kinds of incidents might have been stereotypical, but what also happened was the colonists basically ignored any outrage by the Native Americans in the region at these kinds of incidences. The Native Americans, therefore, under Metacom or King Philip, so King Philip is the native leader, kind of keep that in mind, they would attack the outlying villages in Plymouth Colony, and then they'd move forward, and they actually got within about like 20 miles of Boston, and other Native Americans groups would join in this uprising as well. However, by the summer of 1676, basically the Indians were exhausted, mostly due to disease though, and King Philip or Metacom had actually died in an ambush. The war is going to end soon after. Overall, in this conflict, about 1,000 colonists died, and when it comes to Native Americans, about 3,000 died. This is just a report of King Philip's War. I just wanted to point out something. So if you look in this first section, it says, some believe that there have been vagrant and Jesuitical priests who have made it their business for some years past to go from sanctum to sanctum to exasperate the Indians against the English and bring them into a confederacy, and that they were promised supplies from France and other parts to extirpate the English nation out of the continent of America. And so you can see here, they're not blaming this uprising on like their own actions. It's very much, oh, it must be some sort of conspiracy that the French did this against us. And then the second paragraph, it says, but the government of Massachusetts has contributed much to their misfortunes, for they first taught the Indians the use of arms and admitted them to be present at all their musters and trainings and shewed them how to handle, mend, and fix their muskets, and have been furnished with all sorts of arms by permission of the government. So here they're blaming themselves, but not because of the actions they took, but because they taught the Native Americans how to use European weaponry and everything. So you can see the English's views when it came to the Native Americans in this conflict. The second of the conflicts is going to be in Virginia. This is in the summer of 1676, so right as King Philip's War is ending, we get Bacon's Rebellion. What happened here is settlers are going to attack Native Americans in the region to seize their lands, and then Native Americans would strike back. So the colonists were really led by Nathaniel Bacon. So when we talk about Bacon's Rebellion, Bacon is an English colonist. Nathaniel Bacon led this very violent campaign against all Native Americans, even those who were at peace with the government. There were Native Americans that had like truces with Virginia's government and everything, and yet Nathaniel Bacon leads these attacks against all natives. Now, obviously, this is going to actually be problematic, not just because it's, natives versus the English, but it's also going to be English versus the English on some level, because the government is going to order Bacon and his followers to stop these attacks, but Bacon just goes on to defy them. The thing is, Bacon and his followers really are going to see themselves as representing the interests of established tobacco planters, and basically they wanted things like they wanted to lower taxes and easier access to land for those who had been previously indentured servants, which really meant they just wanted the right to take away land from Indians. So because of this, they would go on to burn Indian villages, massacre inhabitants. The House of Burgesses in Virginia would actually try to appease them by allowing them, oh, you can seize land of Indians that had left their village without permission, and even would legalize the enslavement of Indians, but it really was too little too late on some level. The thing is, we're going to eventually see English troops from England have to be brought over to put down the rebellion. However, by the time they arrive, Bacon has died, and a lot of his followers have returned home. Still, it had been technically treason against the English government because they were ordered to stop and they didn't. And so the English authorities are going to round up about 23 men. But really, when you look at the victims of all this, it's going to be the Virginian Indians, because they basically lose a lot of their remaining lands and are forced to move west or just live in poverty on the edges of society. It also tells us something about the changes of society here, because this is really the moment that a lot of historians cite as being the change of the English going from using indentured servants to slaves. And the whole thing is, with indentured servants here, there was an element of that they eventually got their freedom and then they want more, whereas slaves, they didn't have to worry about that because you were a slave for life. And so Bacon's Rebellion is often cited as being one of the reasons that the English are going to actually dig their heels and use slavery even more after this, because it's a conflict of indentured and servants versus those who are not, just as much so as it was against the English versus the Native Americans. The third conflict, though, is the Pueblo Revolt. This is in New Mexico, so this is looking at the Spanish. Technically, this also started in 1675. I know, they're all happening around the same time, so that tells you something about this time frame. The thing is, a governor there is going to arrest 47 religious Native American leaders on sorcery charges, and then they would publicly whip these Native leaders, and then they released all of them except for 4 who they sentenced to death. This was very much the Spanish trying to stamp out the Pueblo religion. So that happened in 1675. The actual Pueblo Revolt, though, happens in 1680. Pope, I know, ironic because he's a Native American and not a Spaniard, Pope, who was one of the freed leaders that had been whipped publicly, is basically going to lead the Pueblo Revolt. He organized basically this whole revenge network of rebels. These rebels came from numerous villages, and they would all simultaneously, or try to simultaneously, attack Spanish settlements. They would destroy Christian symbols, make converts wash their baptism away, and literally in a few weeks they basically destroyed or damaged every Spanish building and killed more than 400 Spanish colonists out there, including quite a few missionaries. By October of that year, the surviving Spaniards are going to flee, and they're not really able to return to this area for another 13 years because they've ostracized themselves so terribly. Okay, there's another half conflict. It's not really a conflict in the same way because it's not a fight, but it is important when we're looking at the Native Americans' position at this time period. We have to look at the Iroquois, who are in this region that you can see pictured here. The Iroquois was a confederation of several different tribes coming together, and they're going to publicly adopt neutrality in 1701. So basically the thing is, if you look at this area, north of it would be controlled by the French and south of it is controlled by the English. But both the French and the English wanted to monopolize the Iroquois' beaver fur trading. Fighting happens. I'm not going into all the details, but basically what happens is a pair of treaties is negotiated separately with Albany as well as Montreal that would recognize the Iroquois as a neutral party, especially when it comes to France versus England, which we're going to get a lot more into in a few more PowerPoints and everything. This is going to basically mean that the Iroquois have managed to play the English off the French, so it gives them more of a position of power, and it means that both the French and the English can't dominate Western lands for at least the next several decades, but it really depends on the French and the English continuing to, well, butt heads. So when we're looking at all of these, I want to ask you this question as part of your journal. These conflicts reveal what exactly about the Native Americans' position at this time? So what is the position of the Native Americans, and how do you know that based off of these incidences?